Benedictine Asceticism. 5 chapters will now be devoted to the inner life, or the personal dealings of the individual soul with God, and will study Saint Benedict's mind, as it may be read in the Rule and in the Benedictine tradition, or the range of subjects embraced under the ideas of self-discipline and prayer. Self-discipline has already been put in the first place, as the most fundamental among the services of that school of God's service that Saint Benedict declared his monasticism to be, and it will be taken in this and the following chapter under the titles of Asceticism and Spiritual Life. Rightly understood, these are indeed but different names for the same thing. Still, it will be convenient to treat them separately, and first, Benedictine Asceticism. Elsewhere I have said, monasticism is a system of living which owes its origins to those tendencies of the human soul which are summed up in the terms asceticism and mysticism. Mysticism may broadly be described as the effort to give effect to the craving for a union of the soul with the deity already in his life, and asceticism as the effort to give effect to that hankering after an ever-progressive purification of the soul and an atoning for sin by renunciation and self-denial in things lawful. These two tendencies may well be said to be general instincts of humanity, because, though not always called into activity, they are always liable to be evoked, and in all ages and among all races they frequently have asserted themselves. Indeed, the history of religion shows that they are among the most deep-rooted and widespread instincts of the human soul, and monasticism is the attempt to develop and regulate their exercise. It is necessary briefly to set forth the real nature of asceticism and its place in Christian life, because without a proper notion of the theory of asceticism, it would not be possible to understand Benedictine monasticism, or any monasticism whatsoever. Asceticism denotes strictly ethical training, self-discipline in the widest sense of the term. So understood, asceticism must be an ingredient in every seriously lived Christian life, and as in any well-ordered moral life. But the name is hardly used of the ordinary endeavors of a good life. It connotes some special kind of endeavor, some sort of effort at self-denial and spiritual achievement beyond what is required in order to work out our salvation. It is a subject on which much has been written of late, and thoughtful non-Catholic opinion has traveled far from the crude old Protestant view that asceticism is unchristian and unnatural. To mention only English works, the subject is well dealt with in the chapters 1 and 3 of Henne's Spirit and Origin of Christian Monasticism, and more briefly in the first chapter of Lothar Clark's St. Basil, and 100 columns are devoted to it in Hastings' Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, where it is to be treated in full in a dozen sections by as many writers. It will be helpful to give various definitions or descriptions of asceticism from these writers, especially as they regard it from more or less critical standpoints. In the section Christian Asceticism of Hastings' Encyclopedia by well-known Protestant scholar Dr. Otto Zuckler, author of an exhaustive monograph Ascese and Monctum, and following account is given. The word, when used in the sphere of religion and ethics, denotes self-preparation for a virtuous course of conduct, the zealous practice of acts of devotion and morality. This practice of virtue, in the narrower and stricter sense, or what may be called moral gymnastic, may consist in exercises of an inward kind, prayer offered in the heart, examination of conscience and the like, or in acts of self-discipline, passing over into the outward life, self-mortifications by fastings, voluntary poverty, sexual continence, etc. Mr. Lothar Clark writes, asceticism is severe self-discipline undertaken for religious ends, and exercise with reference both to the natural desires of the body and distractions of the outer world. Mortification is a term closely akin to asceticism, and perhaps rather signifies the acts whereby the idea of asceticism is carried out in practice. The word goes back to St. Paul. The idea in ascetical language is the killing of the self in all of its evil manifestations: self-love, self-conceit, self-will, self-seeking, and every form of selfishness. Like asceticism, it is eternal or external, the external or bodily mortification being of value only insofar as it promotes the internal or spiritual. The well-known English Benedictine ascetic and mystic author, Father Augustine Baker, who will many times be referred to in the sequel, divides the whole range of the spiritual life into the two branches, mortification and prayer, these being only more concrete names for the abstract terms asceticism and mysticism as used above. Father Baker's treatment of mortification is in large measure a treatise on the chief religious virtues, including chapters on patience, humility, and the love of God. The latter would not in ordinary language be considered a mortification, but Father Baker's meaning is that love of God is the mortification of self-love. His conception of mortification is that by it we exercise all duties and practice all virtues with regard to ourselves. Thus, in general, mortification includes the exercise of all virtues. For in every act of virtue we mortify some inordinate passion and inclination of nature, so that to attain to perfect mortification is to be possessed of all virtues. Further, he says that prayer is in itself the most excellent and effectual mortification, for in it and by it the most secret risings of inordinate passions are contradicted. Such teaching carries the idea of interior or spiritual mortification to its extreme limit. It is under the leading idea of renunciation that Mr. Hannay considers asceticism, and also Mr. Workman, for whom monasticism is but a chapter in the long story of renunciation in the Christian Church, and in this they have Cassian with them, whose favorite name for monks is renunciant. Hannay writes, asceticism is the refusal to make any compromise with the ways of the world, even which ways which are without taint of actual sins, and such asceticisms as poverty, living in community, virginity, and fasting are each of them a great renunciation of the world and its ways. And so the three great renunciations consecrated in the three vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity have at all times been looked on as classic asceticisms. The idea of renunciation of the world was the most general conception of the monastic life, withdrawal being the earliest technical term for becoming a monk, a renouncing of the businesses and ambitions and pleasures of life, even the lawful ones. It implied solitude and silence, either absolute as with hermits or mitigated as with Cenobites, and it involved in varying degrees a number of lesser renunciations, as of intoxicants or creature comforts or intellectual pursuits, largely at the choice of the individual. The foregoing writers, even so uncompromisingly a Protestant as Dr. Zuckler, recognize that renunciation and asceticism, so understood, are found in the New Testament. They have a place in our Lord's life, a life of virginity, with one recorded severe fast and poverty, at all times real and sometimes extreme, which those who accept the Christian tradition must believe to have been voluntarily chosen. The Sermon on the Mount is highly ascetical, and so are many phrases of St. Paul's teaching. Asceticism soon found expression in the early Church, and was recognized and well-established feature in Christian life before the monastic movement of the 4th century. All this is in accord with the trend of recent thought. But for all that, Canon Hannay is probably right in saying that a bedrock difference between Protestantism and Catholicism still lies precisely in this matter of asceticism and in the outlook on life. For Protestantism, the ideal of the highest Christian life is a well-ordered and religious use of the good things of life. It has little or no sympathy with renunciations or even purely spiritual asceticism, except in so far as they are necessary to secure this object. And for most of Father Baker's interior mortifications, it would have scant approval. Protestantism denies the theories of counsels of perfections as distinguished from precepts of the Christian code, and on the validity of this distinction, as Canon Hannay says, the theoretical justification of monasticism rests. As the matter cannot be discussed in this place, I am content to refer to his striking appendix of Counsels and Precepts, wherein he deals with it in view of the most modern Protestant position, that of Roth, which leads, he declares, to conclusions against the heart and conscience alike cry out. This must suffice on the general question of asceticism. From what has been said, it appears that asceticism falls under the three branches. 1. There is purely internal self-discipline in spiritual exercising, carried out in mind and heart and soul, without becoming in any way external. 2. There are the three great renunciations, especially those of the three evangelical councils, poverty, obedience, chastity, which have at all times been recognized as the principal external asceticisms. 3. There are the various forms of corporal austerities or bodily mortifications. The first will be dealt with in the next chapter on the spiritual life. In regard to the second, it is enough to say that the renunciations of the three councils, which are of the essence of the monastic state in all its forms, were adopted by Saint Benedict without compromise. Obedience is the explicit object of one of the Benedictine vows, and if poverty and chastity are not, personal poverty and renunciation of private ownership is explicitly exacted, and in very complete fashion, by the rule. As for chastity, it is taken for granted as a condition of the life. To love chastity is one of Saint Benedict's instruments of good works, and it cannot be doubted that the expressions, "the monk has no power over his own body," is used in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 4, and means that one professed monk, the monk is bound to the observance of chastity. It is the third branch of asceticism, that of corporal austerity, that is to be dealt with here, and it is taken first because there is a common tendency to identify asceticism wrongly with this one form, and understand by the term self-inflicted, or at least deliberately chosen and sought, bodily austerities and discomforts. In deference to this current acceptation of the word, it is well to begin the study of Benedictine asceticism by examining Saint Benedict's mind in regard to this kind of mortifications. And in the first place, it has to be noted that of what may be called the artificial self-inflicted penances, the hair shirts, chainlets, spikes, and pricks, and the scourgings that play so large a part in the history of asceticism and have been so conspicuous in later medieval and modern devotional life. There is no trace whatsoever in Saint Benedict's rule, or in his life as told by Saint Gregory. It is true that if exhortations and warnings failed, corporal chastisements, flogging, was resorted to in the case of refractory monks, but it was a punishment, not a mortification, and it was not self-inflicted. The practice of self-flagellations, called taking the discipline, did not come into vogue, at any rate in the West, until long after St. Benedict's time, its introduction being associated with the name of St. Peter Damian in the 11th century. Oriental monks, especially in Syria, commonly practiced artificial penances, often outlandish in character, and European monks in Gaul were imitating them, as we learn from Gregory of Tours, binding heavy weights on their backs and carrying chains. All this is quite foreign to St. Benedict's spirit, for St. Gregory tells us that when a neighboring hermit chained himself to a rock, as Simon Stylites had done before sending his pillar, St. Benedict rebuked him, saying, "If thou be God's servant, let the chain of Christ, not any iron chain, hold thee." Now, we come to the other kind of bodily austerities, those that may be called natural and that form the staple of the mortifications of the great Egyptian hermits, the privations of food and drink, of sleep and clothing, exposure to heat and cold, labors undertaken in order to wear down the body. Before St. Benedict, the practice of these bodily austerities had been looked on as a chief means of attaining the spiritual end of the monastic life. But he prescribed for his monks sufficient food, ample sleep, proper clothing. A number of antitheses between his regulations and those of the previously fashionable Egypt monasticism will bring into clear light the changes he made and the spirit underlying them. In the matter of food, he allows to each daily a pound of bread, and orders 2 dishes of cooked food, and a third of fruit or young vegetables, so that he who cannot eat of one may make his meal of the other. As Abbot Dalat says, this menu would have appeared to the fathers of the desert as intended for monks utterly relaxed. He also allows a measure, a half a pint at least, very likely more, of wine daily. The advice and practice of the Egyptian monks was to reduce the quantity of food and drink almost to a minimum. St. Benedict prescribes only frugality and the avoidance of gluttony. In Egypt there was a constant striving to reduce the amount of sleep to the narrowest possible limit, and such battling the sleep and drowsiness was one of their favorite asceticism. Saint Benedict allows his monks during the greater part of the year more than 8 hours of unbroken sleep each night, and in the summer 5 or 6 hours by night and a siesta by day. See chapter 12 of the Rule of Saint Benedict. In Egypt, the monks slept on the bare ground with stones for pillows, or at best on papyrus mats. And whereas Abbot John in Cassian deplores the degeneracy of the times that a blanket may be found in a hermit's cell, a thing I cannot mention without shame, as he says, Saint Benedict allows not only a blanket, but mattress, coverlet, and a pillow as well. Abbot Pombo of Nitria laid it down that a monk's clothes should be such that if they were left out on the road, no one would think of taking them. Saint Benedict directs that the monks are to get new clothes while the old ones are still fit to be given to the poor. The abbot is to see that the monks' clothes fit them. They are to have warmer clothes in the winter, lighter in summer, and clothes are to be changed for the night and are to be washed. He considers a monk's outfit to consist of 2 cowls or cloaks, 2 tunics, shoes and socks, perhaps gaiters, griddle, knife, pen, needle, handkerchief, and writing tablet. A great contrast with the poverty and nakedness practiced in Egypt. Certain features of the rule appear austere to us in the 20th century. For instance, perpetual abstinence from flesh meat, except in case of sickness, is considered a great austerity today. But to the agricultural laborers of Italy in St. Benedict's time, it would have not seemed so. Nor would the privation of baths have seemed a hardship to Italian peasants of the 6th century. St. Benedict made his monks rise very early, at about 2 a.m., during the greater part of the year, and still earlier in the summer, but they had gone to bed before dark, and had a long prolonged period of unbroken sleep. The idea often held, even by Benedictines, that the midnight office of the Carthusians, breaking the night's rest into 2 portions, is what St. Benedict intended, is not in accordance with fact. The only feature of the life that probably was severe, even to St. Benedict's monk, was the single meal a day. For about half the year, from Easter till mid-September, there were 2 meals, at midday and in the evening. This would not be considered a severe regimen, even by Italians of the upper classes in our own day. It is the actual practice at Monte Cassino, but from mid-September till Lent there was but 1 meal, at about 2:30 p.m. Here it will be appropriate to quote from a writer who knew Italians and their ways so well as the late Marion Crawford. Breakfast, as we understand it, is the unknown meal in Italy even now. Most people drink a cup of black coffee standing. Many eat a morsel of bread or biscuit with it, and get out of doors as soon as they can. But the greediness of an Anglo-Saxon breakfast disgusts all Latins alike, and 2 set meals daily are thought to be enough for anyone, as indeed they are. The hard-working Italian hill peasant will sometimes toast himself a piece of cornbread before going to work, and eat it with a few drops of olive oil. And in absence of tea or coffee, the people of the Middle Ages often drank a mouthful of wine on rising, to move the blood, as they said, but that was all. The Lenten regimen, indeed, with its rising at 2 and working in the fields from 9 till 4, without breaking the fast until the single meal in the late afternoon, must have been a severe physical strain on St. Benedict's monks. But in those days, Lent was intended to be a severe physical strain on all Christians, and St. Benedict's single meal shortly before sunset was still the common discipline of the Church for all her children. St. Benedict considered that the manner of life he established in his monastery would be enough, on the physical side, to enable his monks to arrive at the perfection of the monastic life. And so far from encouraging them to try to go beyond the rule by practicing austerities on their own account, he discouraged private venture into asceticism, and made it a point of virtue that the monk should do nothing except the common rule of the monastery and the example of superiors' exhorts, and that in all things all should follow the rule as mistress. The only exception St. Benedict tolerated was water drinking. In Lent he encourages each to add something voluntarily to the ordinary duties of our service of God in the way of some ascetical exercise beyond the rule, but even then it was to be indicated to the abbot and undertaken only with his approval and blessing. It may be thought that the point is being unduly labored, but it is vital for any true understanding of Saint Benedict, and it has very commonly been misunderstood, even by Benedictines. Not a few Benedictine reforms, especially in the 16th and 17th century, but also in more recent times, have been in great measure based on the idea of restoring the austerity deliberately discarded by Saint Benedict. Traces of this misconception of Saint Benedict's spirit exist at the present day. On November 13th, Benedictines celebrated a feast sometimes called All Monks, but in the official calendar, All Benedictine Saints. In the hymn occur the following lines: Vobis olus cabria furere vel lugiminae, potumque lympha prebuit, humnusque dura lectilum, vesitistis inter aspides, savusque cum draconibus. For a general feast of all monks, no exception could be taken to the hymn, for Benedictines would only find their place in the great crowd of monks of all kind, fathers of the desert, hermits, Syriac and Celtic monks, and the rest, and it would seem this was the hymn writer's intention. Adverte salitudinis clarusque mites inculae. But for a specifically Benedictine feast, the hymn is singularly ill-chosen, being pitched in a wrong key. For vegetable diet, water drinking, sleeping on the bare ground, living with snakes and dragons, not one of those things, though true of Saint Benedict himself in the Sacro Specco, is any part of Benedictine life, and they are all in direct contradiction to the provisions of the rule. Another instance may be produced from our own day. The crypt at Monte Cassino has recently been gorgeously and beautifully decorated by Benedictine monks of the Burin congregation and was solemnly reopened in 1913. In the carvings and reliefs, Saint Benedict and his monks are in bare feet, or in some cases with light sandals, like the discalced Carmelites. It will not be questioned that the human foot is a more beautiful object and lends itself more easily to artistic treatment than a boot. But Saint Benedict says quite definitely, footgear, whatever be the precise meaning of padules in Caligae, probably the 6th century equivalent of socks and shoes. It is regrettable that at Monte Cassino, of all places, so grotesque a notion, and one so alien from Saint Benedict's mind as barefooted Benedictines, should even seem to be countenanced. For like reasons, the familiar presentation of Saint Benedict in the early Umbrian school, finger on lip and rod in hand, as though silence and chastisement were the keynotes of the rule, though appropriate enough for Saint Columban, is, as a symbolizing Saint Benedict's spirit, a parody, doubtfully regrettable in such masters as Guido and Perguino, in other cases so sympathetically appreciative of the spirit of the saints. They probably reflected a wave of reforming rigorism in the Benedictine houses around them. To sum up the matter of Benedictine asceticism so far as it concerns the practice of bodily austerities, Saint Benedict found monasticism in Italy and in Gaul languishing, sinking under the weight of ideals and practices inherited from the East, but unsuited to Western conditions. To meet the case, he did not gather up what remained still an exercise of the primitive austerities and attempt a restoration of the old ascetic life, but struck out a new line, such as seemed to him more fitting for the times and circumstances. And whereas a strong individualism was the keynote of Egyptian monasticism in all its phases, in Western Europe, hardly less than in Egypt, Saint Benedict was a collectivist in the spiritual order. In place of rivalry in aesthetical achievement, he established a common mode of life. In place of rivalry in aesthetical achievement, he established a common mode of life made up of a round of objective duties, none too onerous, common prayer, work, and reading, and the sanctification of the monk was to be found in living the life of the community. This twofold break with the past, and the elimination of austerity and in the sinking of the individual community, made Saint Benedict's rule less a development than a revolution in monasticism. It may almost be called a new creation, and it was destined to prove, as the subsequent history shows, peculiarly adapted to the new races that were repeopling Western Europe.